Hi, welcome back to the channel. And if you caught my earlier music memories, the early years, now we're going to pick up where we left off with that and going to kind of look at some of the preteen, middle school to early high school years. This is my second time recording this, so we are going to try to get this done swiftly because my audio died on me last time. So let's just see what we can do. So when I moved to Louisiana about the time of middle school, upper elementary, I joined Boy Scouts. I had been involved in Cub Scouts when I lived in North Carolina when I was real little, but Boy Scouts turned out to be kind of important towards my musical tastes and development because our scout troop actually bought a bus, and we refurbished it so it was like Boy Scout khaki with red trim, and then they actually added a stereo and sound system to the bus so that we could jam on our way to campouts and camporees and just summer camp. But I was the sort of young folks within the troop, so a lot of times we didn't really control what got played, and so I was exposed to a whole lot of different music through that. And so I'm going to reflect some of that here, but going up through junior high, I just remember some different songs, different groups that I got interested in through being around a different group of students and other kids like me. And one of the first ones I remember was on a field trip. Somebody had like a little stereo or boombox, and they were playing "Lean on Me" by Club Nouveau from 1986, and it sounded similar to stuff that I had listened to in the past, so it was kind of cool. I really dug that song. But one of the first things I remember being introduced to through my scout group was the Beastie Boys album License to Ill. Now, if you're not familiar, I mean, I don't know where you've been, but this album was very influential to me because I had grown up listening to, the breakdancing stuff, the early hip hop, old school sort of stuff. And here was a group of like three white guys doing this kind of rap but rock sort of thing. I really loved like No Sleep Till Brooklyn off of that and some of those things, but it was just so crazy, unusual, and different from anything I had heard till then. Of course, the hair metal thing was coming into its own, and one of my faves was Def Leppard Hysteria from '87. I had the vinyl 7-inch single of Faith by George Michael. Scouts also introduced me to this crazy band that looked like just a bunch of Harley biker club sort of thing called Guns N' Roses. Appetite for Destruction was the album. Of course, that's where we get Paradise City, Sweet Child of Mine, things like that. There was another band I was introduced to and actually had a vinyl single of, Where the Streets Have No Name by U2. But I didn't know at the time that U2, that a significant portion of the band were kind of outspoken Christians and believers, and so that was interesting for me. I also had I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For. Interestingly enough, that song later shows up again as I'm a young adult, and it was at a Promise Keepers rally. It was used for like an invitation sort of song. A crazy song that I got introduced to through Scouts, and it reminded me somewhat of Weird Al, but much more extreme, was Anthrax, I'm the Man. Just crazy song. And then in junior high at the school that I eventually went to, that was an independent school, they had a school kind of school fair day sort of thing, and they would have different events and booths, and one of the contests or things where you could win stuff was a tape walk, which was basically like a cakewalk. If you've ever been to the event where you get your ticket, you get your number, you walk around, and if they call your number, you get to win either choosing one of the cakes from off the table in a cakewalk. But in a cassette or tape walk, there were a bunch of cassettes that had been brought in, and you got to select one. Through that, I actually won a copy of White Lion Pride, and I fell in love with that album. Everything from When the Children Cry to Wait. It was just the guitar just like would reach down and like tear out your guts, man. I mean, it just like cut like a knife right to the core of you, and the lead singer's vocals were just as good and clean and neat, and it was just impressive music to me as a young like preteen, and I loved that album. It was back to front. I could listen to the whole thing, and they didn't have as much of a bad boy image as a lot of the other hair bands of the time, and so I really kind of enjoyed them. Then, interesting story to this one, at Boy Scout camp, instead of reveille or something to wake up the scouts at a camporee, they actually chose to crank up the bus sound system to an interesting song, and that was how I was introduced to Metallica 1. Which, if you're familiar with the song, it starts out very smooth, clean, acoustic, kind of relaxing, almost a song you would think would put somebody to sleep. But if you stayed in your tent and your sleeping bag too long, and it gets to that later portion of the song, talk about being abruptly jarred to wake. That was something else. Let's just say that was an experience out there at camp, and all of a sudden, James Hetfield is screaming at you. But it was cool. One of my favorite, I guess, a little bit edgier. They weren't really edgy or anything, but they were cool. I enjoyed them. I loved the visuals because I was in love with that chartreuse lime green of the era. But Nothing But a Good Time by Poison and their albums sort of thereafter. I can't tell you how many times I practiced on my notebook to draw that P letter from their logo for their name. But anyway, 88, of course, was the year, and like Bon Jovi's New Jersey was taking things by storm. Some other students in my class I knew of actually would start to get to see these bands in concert, and I just never did. I mean, my dad wasn't really into that kind of music, and my mom, she was okay with it, but I mean, spending that much money to go see somebody in concert probably wasn't really going to be her thing. So other hair bands or other different songs of that time, Don't Know What You Got Till It's Gone by Cinderella, Just Like Paradise by David Lee Roth. I had that vinyl single. I got cassette singles of quite a few of the DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince songs, like Parents Just Don't Understand, Nightmare on My Street. I think those were the main two that I had, but I was aware of the other ones. This was well before he got more famous in his own right for his own name there, Will Smith. Basically, our junior high years, kids listened to metal, rock, hair band stuff, and hip-hop was starting to come into its own. Supersonic by JJ Fad, that was one that I had. I also, there's another story, but it's not going to be on this video. I had the album Sir Mix-a-Lot Swass, related to a specific song on that album was tied to a nickname that I acquired through scouting. So was listening to a variety of different things and all. And then in '89, of course, Debbie Gibson's Electric Youth dropped, and I'd always been partial to some female pop stars. Motley Crue's Dr. Feelgood, Tom Petty, Full Moon Fever. I love that album. Once again, that's another that I would consider kind of all killer, no fillers on that. I had another couple of hip-hop singles. Tone Loc did Wild Thing, his version song. Funky Cold Medina. And then there was Bust a Move by Young MC. But then in the summer of '89, I had a big change. And if you've seen my very first video that I did that was about a certain song, then you already know a little bit of this story. But in '89, I was old enough that I was finally in the youth group at our church, and we went to Centrifuge Camp at then Mobile College. It's now University of Mobile. But I got the tape, the compilation tape of various artists from that camp, and the theme was kind of a 50s theme. Every one of your small groups at the camp were named after different 50s bands and artists. My particular group was the Shirelles. Of course, all the camp counselors were the mamas and the papas, and the theme overall was called Good News for Fast Times. But it had a cassette that went along with it, and a lot of the songs were older stuff. Some of the ones that were on there, they had some Russ Taff, they had some Michael W. Smith was on there, and then there were a few that were kind of rockin' or pop. Kenny Marks was on there. He had a rather famous in Christendom song about the dangers of partying and, you know, doing things as a teenager. But then there was this one song, and it was really one of the older songs on the album, called Clean by Petra. And it just started with this wailing guitar, and I just never heard anything like that was considered like church or Christian or okay, you know, as far as those sort of things. And so it blew my mind, and I asked my mom, I said, look, I don't know anything else that this band does, but you're going to Monroe, just pick me up something by them from one of the music stores. And so she brought back this cassette called On Fire. And I literally wore that cassette out. It was just, I had never heard anything that sounded like the content and the music of things that we might sing about in worship at church, but yet it was done in a way with wailing guitars, distortion, drums. It was just amazing. I had never heard anything quite like that. And so I followed that up, and I just carried on. I eventually got Petra Praise, The Rock Cries Out, which was a totally praise and worship album. Petra Means Rock, which was kind of a collection or greatest hits album of other of their earlier stuff, because I hadn't even known they were a band, and here they had been doing songs for years. And then there was Beyond Belief, Unseen Power. There was just, they just kept doing these albums, and as you can see, Unseen Power came out in '91, and that was right before a big thing sort of happened, and I'll get to that a little bit later, but that's going to be the transition into the next video. But other things that I listened to at the time, I would scour and find on the local stations late at night. I could record on a video VHS tape this program called Light Music, and they played, it was like MTV of the Christian stuff that was out, and that started to open my awareness to other bands that were out there. And so I learned about DC Talk. At the time they were doing the New Thing album, but it had a song that oh my gosh, my mind was like blown by the song Walls off of New Thing, because here they were, they had quotes by Martin Luther King Jr., and here were two white guys and a black guy in a hip-hop but yet rock sort of sounding song that was talking about breaking down segregation and racism and getting along with one another, but it had some teeth, it had some punch. Let me just finish rounding out some of this, because I got one other point that I want to get to. Another one that was like totally our ride home with the guys from football practice, Black Crowes, Shake Your Money Maker. Most people like Hard to Handle, She Talks to Angels, but my favorite personally off of Shake Your Money Maker had to be Twice as Hard. The grit of that song and the way it starts out is just incredible. Some other hip hop, Tic Tac Toe by Kuiper. He was in the more local club dance music hip hop scene. MC Hammer, of course, in 90, and Vanilla Ice. And then we had a change of youth minister at our church, and the youth minister that we had, he was he didn't deny that there was like Christian music of other kinds, but he was much more exclusively Southern gospel was where his heart and soul was. And as a youth minister, he got some complimentary tickets to a concert that was going to be in Monroe. And he was like, look, I don't listen to this sort of stuff, but here, you can have them. Well, at the time, I wasn't driving yet, so my mom drives me to my first Christian hard rock or metal concert. It was White Cross, and they were on their In the Kingdom tour, and they were opened up with a band known as Fighter. And they were an incredible band too. They had a drummer. He actually had the gear, and he was doing the singing. And so that was just an amazing thing. Of course, along this time, because he really believed in Southern gospel quartet type music as being the thing, I struggled a lot. And so did some of the folks in our youth group. We were shown something called Hillsbillies, The Dangers of Rock and Roll, and it talked about like all kinds of things. I guess nowadays it would seem rather conspiracy theory, but you know, we would get into, okay, we need to do away with all this music that's talking about bad things and evil things, and we try to clear that out of our lives so that we could be closer to God and all this sort of stuff. And so my mother and I went to another concert about that era of my life, and it was 3 gospel groups that were in Monroe: the Kingsmen, the McCameys, and Goal City. And I love some of their music too. The Kingsmen had an especially good band, and I had a live album of theirs that the bass on some of those songs would thump just as hard as on some of my hip-hop music. And so it was a confusing time, because I had all these different influences bringing in all these different types of music. I was starting to come into my own of learning about Christian bands and alternatives that were out there, and I was finding stuff that was really blowing my mind. Some other things that I had a few singing tracks for church solos. I had Awesome God by Rich Mullins, Thank You by Ray Boltz, and also had Hosanna by Sandy Patty from that Was It a Morning Like This album that I mentioned in the early years video. But I've definitely gone pretty far with this, because it was pretty much an explosion of music in my middle school years, and I may have to cut these into little shorter segment videos for the future. But till next time, I'm going to try this out as a tagline. We'll see. But till next time, keep it PG.